Well, until long after 1867, a large majority of people in Canada lived in rural areas, and in 1941, half still did. Yet if rural people appear in Canadian business history, they tend to be workers or producers or customers, not active participants in actual businesses. If there's been a systematic account of rural business as such, I'm not aware of it. And so what I picture this talk as being is agenda setting rather than answering questions. I want to talk about what such an account would need to cover. My theme is what Daniel Sampson, writing about Nova Scotia, calls the dynamism of the countryside itself. I want to begin with a quote from Michael Bliss, partly to celebrate his contributions to Canadian business history, but also because it makes my main point. Now, this is actually an expression of regret in the early part of Northern Enterprise. There's a longer sentence that this is extracted from. What historically was Canada's most important single industry, the business of farming, is traditionally slighted in the writing of business history and has been shortchanged in most other areas of Canadian historical writing in the last few years. Well, since that was written in 1987, historians have paid greater attention to rural history. My move to Guelph was part of Guelph's recognition that it wanted to make a bigger say in rural history. But most of the writings on rural history set farmers and other rural producers outside a capitalism whose growth is generally seen as fundamentally in conflict with the issues and the values of ordinary producers. While recognizing market-oriented activity, these historians place their main emphasis on what the title of one book calls the limits of rural capitalism. The emphasis is on how rural is not capitalist. Well, seeing farms in a business framework affords an alternative perspective. Well, the first thing about farming, as historians have been demonstrating increasingly, is its variety. This is a quotation relating to seigneurial agriculture in the seigneurial countryside in mid-18th century New France. The point is that farms varied widely, both within regions and among regions. But despite this, and despite all the technological and institutional changes of context over the 2 centuries after this quotation refers to, I think many of the issues that farm families needed to take into account remained fairly standard. And so I'm, in a way, treating a very long period of time as if it were a single span of time. I don't want to underestimate the importance of changes over that time, however. Well, consider the diary entries for 1890 by Ephraim Cressman, who was a farmer near Kitchener, or near Berlin as it then was, in the heartland of southern Ontario agriculture. What the slide reports is the number of days on which he records off-farm marketing. He also records buying seed, buying livestock feed, new farm equipment, employing a hired man and a female household servant, investing a great deal of time in farm improvements, notably fencing and drainage, and along the way participating in founding a co-op. So he reports a total of 53 days of off-farm marketing, and he doesn't always give you the value of how much he's sold. And particularly, he doesn't on the 31 days that he delivers firewood over January, February, and December. Firewood is clearly an important part of his routine. The single biggest transaction happened on a single day when he sold 2 colts for $225. But you could see there hogs, cattle, lambs, wool, wheat, butter, eggs, potatoes, all sold at one point or another during the year. And one suspects that that's just his marketing. What his wife might have sold would be different again. So that there's probably more came from that farm than just what he recorded. Well, my second example is from the 1901 diary of Rebecca Else, who was operating a farm near Wolfville, Nova Scotia, with her 18-year-old son. We heard about the Klondike gold rush this morning. Well, her husband had gone off to the Klondike and had never come back, leaving her with the farm. At the end of the year, she added up the year and she reported producing 1,363 1/4 pounds of butter. And that last 1/4 really speaks to me somehow or other. That's how much butter she produced. Most of it she sold at 20 cents a pound. Somewhere along the way, probably midsummer, she wrote, "I do get tired working with the butter sometimes, but it brings us in quite a lot of money." One of the decisions that Rebecca made was to consign her apples for sale in England and to wait for the return until the apples had been sold there. So she took the risk and paid the costs to have her apples shipped to England. When the money came in, she writes, "I can't help feeling thankful all the time that we did not sell to Onderdonk. How our Heavenly Father watches over all our doings." The returns were so much more satisfactory for selling those apples in England rather than selling them to the local agent. But she sold her pigs locally. They're not 6 months old yet, but feed is high, so I thought I'd better sell now. Well, the point of these two examples is that Cressman and Ells were thinking about risks, and they were engaged in sophisticated market-oriented enterprises. Farming is often pictured as simple. If you ever encounter a serious farm diary, you realize it's anything but. And this is the case for seeing farms in a business context. They involved all sorts of decisions regarding investments and strategy, about buying, selling land, how to improve the farm, what to produce, what varieties, what quantities, which markets are you aiming at, how are you going to access those markets, how you will allocate the time of family members. And I'm not picturing the head of the household as the sole allocator of time. I assume that time is a subject of bargaining as well within families, that it's not a unilateral thing as in a place of employment where the boss may decree how the work will be organized. But family time and its organization is the crucial part of a farm. When and how, for what, to hire non-family labor. How to manage animals, including buying, breeding, selling, feeding, care, and utilization. Penny isn't here today, so I can complain about her presentation of Ontario agriculture as about wheat until the 1870s. I've only been arguing against that for 30 years. It's a measure of failure that people still think of an animalless rural culture in Ontario until the 1870s. It just completely underestimates the centrality of animals in farm life and activity. One of the other questions was whether to borrow, for what, from whom. And then there was the question of whether and when and where to work away from the farm, or for some family members to work away from the farm. So it seems to me there are an awful lot of decisions regarding investments and strategy in any farm activity. Well, writing about prairie agriculture, which was set up in a very different context from Ontario or Quebec or Nova Scotia, my earlier examples, Lyle Dick sums it up. Farming demanded astute management to turn the anticipated returns into reality. So Lyle Dick makes a very clear point that management is an essential part of any successful farm. Well, in the written version of the paper, I argue that many of these points apply even to farming on the forest and mining frontier in those few areas where there was actually arable land outside of the fertile areas of the country. And I also want to argue, or try to argue, that you can make an equivalent case for the inshore fishery in the Atlantic region. But for the rest of the time now, I want to talk about villages. And here I mainly want to draw attention to the standard forms of enterprise in village society and to emphasize the importance of taking them seriously. Even in small villages with populations of 100 or 200, agriculture sustained a wide variety of rural business. Well, this is the general store at Lang Pioneer Village in Peterborough County. It was a real store in a small crossroads village east of Peterborough that was moved there in the 1960s. I think it's unassuming to our eyes, but stores like this had substantial sales running into the thousands of dollars per year. And a key point is that most villages had more than one store, and you don't get this point in any average historical village, which only has one. retailing was highly competitive. General stores did sell local goods, but mainly they sold imported goods. And the wholesalers who imported those goods were among the leading figures in Canadian business until the later 19th century, when the Canadian business system became very much more complex. And the prominence of big city wholesalers obviously rested on the health of rural retailing. Underlying the visible flow of goods, credit bound the system together, from wholesaler to retailer to customer. And for the village store, the credit relationship with clients afforded other opportunities. In fact, retailers often are the central figures in local entrepreneurial worlds. The storekeeper is more than just a storekeeper. He's a central entrepreneurial figure in a local community. Well, the other characteristic commercial institution in a village was the inn and tavern. And there were at least as many inns and taverns in rural society as there were stores. This one was on the Bay of Quinte. The sketch is from about 1830. Now, elite travelers told horrible tales of Canadian inns. Temperance advocates denounced them fiercely as destructive of the morale of the colony, but in fact, they were serious businesses. They provided accommodation, including stabling and feed for horses. They provided food, they provided sociability, and they provided space for a wide variety of public activities as well. As this image suggests, these were substantial enterprises and not just the kind of substandard places that the typical British travel writer wrote about as he toured through the province. They're also among the earliest enterprises in Canada to be subject to state regulation. Their licenses specified minima for space, for services, and for orderly conduct. And they necessarily also provided living space for the proprietor's family. And as with farms, family members were responsible for much, but not necessarily all of the work of an inn. So family and business are totally intertwined in these kinds of rural enterprises. Well, I want to turn now to industry, which in Canada until the 1850s was mainly rural. Although there were some windmills, notably in New France, most industry was powered by water, and many villages grew up at water power sites. This is the mill at Delta, which is in Leeds County in eastern Ontario. It was built in 1810. It was apparently the largest mill in Upper Canada in 1810. It's clearly a substantial operation. It's now a National Historical Site. That picture was taken before its restoration. Well, grist and sawmills were found throughout agricultural districts. And just by the number of them, you can infer that most of them were mainly local in their clientele. But the fact that many of them survived for a very long time suggests they must have been profitable to their owners. Typically, they combined custom milling for their customers along with commercial operations. So they were both milled on commission for their customers, and they bought raw materials for their own transformation. Wherever farms produced wool for local weaving, there usually was a woolen mill for carding and fulling. And until about 1850, when serious consolidation set in, many grist mills were also associated with distilleries. So in effect, at a single mill site, you could find up to 4 distinct processes at work, processing wood and wheat and other grains perhaps, wool and distilling as well. And each called for specialized skills. Now, how these were associated could vary. There might be a single owner who employed people to work in all of these areas, or each segment might operate as an independent business. Well, from very early, and certainly from before the conquest, the main urban and export markets for grain and wood were supplied by large commercial mills at particularly powerful mill sites in locations favorable to drawing supplies from beyond their immediate vicinity. And these mills were fully integrated into the provincial business system. Some were directly owned by leading merchants. Others were closely tied to leading merchants by contract and credit. These are not all the mills in rural society. In smaller numbers, you could find flax mills, of course. We have the world expert on them right here, so I won't say more. Plaster mills, ironworks, paper mills. There was a claim that paper mills were urban this morning, but mostly they were not. They could be urban because of the need for rags to power as their input, but quite a few paper mills were found outside the towns as well. On the Atlantic coast, a number of villages had significant boat and shipbuilding operations. Later, of course, there were cheese factories in many rural areas. So there's a wide range of rural industry beyond the mills that I've talked about. Well, the second main area of non-farm production in rural areas was by craftsmen. In Upper Canada, the census counted more than 30,000 men in rurally oriented craft occupations in 1851. Most of them were outside the main cities. I tried to think of how to present that, and I decided to put the number of crafts in 4 Ontario villages in the mid-1840s to give you an idea of what some of those crafts were and the degree to which they were spread out. The source does not indicate carpenters, who are the leading trade, in fact, and it reveals millers, sawyers, distillers, coopers, and weavers indirectly by counting mills rather than by counting the trades themselves. Well, the men who conducted these trades are often categorized by historians as members of the working class, and their skills are very commonly described as traditional. Yet they can just as easily be seen as engaged in business. Blacksmiths, shoemakers, tailors, tanners, harness makers, millwrights, wheelwrights, wagon makers typically sold their output in the market. So did most carpenters and weavers, and many coopers who were not employed directly by a mill. For such men, their key investment was in the knowledge needed to practice and keep up with their trades. Finding a place to work, building a clientele, hiring help or training apprentices, and managing credit and payments all involve choices and strategy that can readily be seen in a business context. It's clear also that such men worked in a competitive environment. Even small villages often had more than one representative of a specific craft. And if there was only one in your village, there might be another one in the very next village, which wasn't very far away. And farmers who lived between those villages would have a choice of which way to go to do their shopping. There was a second type of competition that affected some trades much more than others, and that was the competition that came from mechanization that transformed work processes, making them amenable to factory-scale production. Among rural crafts, shoemakers and coopers felt this most acutely in the 19th century. Others continued with much less disruption. Some rural craftspeople, indeed, would move into new industries as they appeared. For example, agricultural implement making might be something that a rural craftsman would go into. Well, this has been a pretty gendered talk, except for Rebecca, but it seems to me that first of all, census data on craftswomen are notoriously bad. We know that many more women made a living by sewing in fashion in one way or another than were counted. But I think they tended to be in larger communities more than in farming communities, although farm women did make money sewing, and perhaps in some other areas as well. And of course we know that women like Rebecca ended up running farms. Women ended up running inns and stores as well, often in a family context that they would acquire the proprietorship as widows or in other contexts. Well, let me conclude before Andrew shuts me off. I prepared a summary to indicate orders of magnitude for these categories in Upper Canada in the mid-19th century. And I think in agricultural areas in the other colonies, the numbers would be proportional to the population. And I think these data justify seeing Canada's rural majority as key elements in the larger ecosystem of Canadian business. in a colony of less than 1 million people, over half of whom were 16 or under. So not that, then you divide the other half into men and women. You can start to see that the people I've got counted here begin to add up to a majority of the household heads in the population. There are almost 5,000 shops and inns, almost 3,000 mills and tanneries, over 30,000 men who gave rural-oriented craft as their occupation, and almost 100,000 occupiers of land. That's how the census counted it. The number of actual working farms would have been smaller, and some of those farms would have been occupied. Some of those occupiers were actually craftsmen. So you can't add all those up to get a number because there are some overlaps in categories. But broadly speaking, and considering the role of family, particularly in agriculture, these numbers demonstrate the centrality of self-employment rather than wage work in rural economies. Well, I got a chance to ask a question yesterday, and I get to say I got it confirmed in one of the sessions yesterday, so I'm comfortable making the statement that distinguishing self-employment from business can be an arbitrary distinction. Even now, it certainly is, as we just heard a reference over lunch to the question of personal corporations. Are they businesses? Are they tax devices? What are they? But finding a way to distinguish self-employment from business is not easy and can be arbitrary. But I think, and if that's true now, imagine what it's like before 1914, which is what I'm talking about. Although self-employment might represent marginality rather than autonomy, I think it would be wrong to assume that that was the norm, that most self-employed were marginal. I think that was completely not the case. And to set the self-employed outside business would mean setting the entire rural economy outside the business system. And it would certainly obscure the adaptability and openness to change of many, even most participants in the rural economy. When studied closely, we find them quite ready to adapt and to change and to read markets and to do new things. Focusing on rural enterprise reveals how much of the market was made by independent economic actors, mainly in everyday face-to-face transactions that have left few traces in the documents that historians have generally relied upon. But I think with imagination, much more can be done to reveal the scope and variety of what long was the largest component of the Canadian business world. Thanks.